next when it comes to the global economy? What is the outlook according to author and economist Linda Yueh? Welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming back to hear an economist. After all, economics has been defined as the science of telling you things you've known your whole life, but in a language you can't understand. So what I hope to do is to set out the global economic uncertainties, which I think that's a good way of looking at what the world looks like. But I want to do it both in terms of an economic outlook, and then I want to talk about risks and opportunities in this world, and then I want to finish off with how businesses might cope with this going forward. So the first thing I'm going to give you is one of many caveats. So the very first one is, I just told you I'm going to give you an economic outlook, but I do want you to remember what the great economist J.K. Galbraith said, which is the sole function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable. But we all have to do it. So the global outlook economically is actually much better than what it is geopolitically. So economically, we saw, for instance, just today, the European Central Bank has cut interest rates to 2%. Now, that's significant because we have now gone through years where the interest rate was highly restrictive, as in it dampened economic activity. And the ECB said that at 2%, it's in the middle of their neutral range. So that means cost of capital, cost of financing, all of these things are going to be at least not hampered by monetary policy. And the ECB has done this. We may well see it continuing rate cuts from other central banks as well. So to me, the business cycle is beginning to, again, be neutral in terms of growth, but that should be more supportive. And in fact, that is a function of what's happening because of the geopolitics. Because US tariffs, because of the uncertainties, there's a lot of downside risks to growth, and I think this is actually causing monetary policy to move and potentially move even into supportive territory. So that, I'm afraid, is one of the good bits of news. The worrying bits of news is the outlook will be characterized by probably more US tariffs in the same, I would say, uncertain way that we have seen it. So someone asked me the other day, the UK had negotiated a trade agreement with the US, the first one, in fact. So is the UK better off? My answer was, the UK is better off than it was on April the 2nd, Liberation Day, but it's not as well off as it was on April the 1st. And that is the world I think we will be looking at for the next few years, because there's lots of lawsuits challenging US tariffs, but there's different legal bases where the president can impose tariffs. And we should expect it coming from not just the broad-based tariffs, but also what's called Section 232, which are tariffs imposed based on national security. So right now, it's on steel and aluminum and on cars. And there's now investigations which will take it into more sectors. So these are the tariffs that have just been doubled from 25 to 30%, literally overnight. So that, I think, is the environment that we are looking at. So the question now is, in this environment, how should we think about the risks and the opportunities? So I want to talk to you about a multi-aligned world. Okay, I'm going to give you my next caveat, which is I'm an American, British, Chinese. I have Chinese heritage. I'm American from how I sound, but I'm actually British. So when I say we, I could be referring to anybody. So when I'm talking about the multi-aligned world, what I'm referring to is we're used to this idea of multipolar growth coming from different poles around the world. Multi-aligned actually is a variation on that. In other words, countries and companies may need to think about how to be aligned on different things at different times. So in other words, rather than just saying we're wholly aligned with the US, we're wholly aligned with the European Union, we're wholly aligned with China, you may find you are aligned on some things, but you're not aligned on others. And being multi-aligned is different than being non-aligned, which is how India likes to think about the world. It is actually about how do you find the areas in which cooperation makes sense, competition makes sense, and other areas in which you may not want to engage. So to be multi-aligned, I think it is the world in which we live. And I say that because we do live in a world of great power competition. So the US and China tensions are likely to be with us for some time, which means being multi-aligned may well be a way of trying to maneuver through some of this in the coming years. Now, when I say great powers competition, you may be wondering, what is that exactly? So I've already told you I can claim to be many nationalities. So I'm going to tell a couple of jokes to try and capture what I mean by the era of great power competition. Americans, in their heart of hearts, would really just like to be the G1. China likes to say, if you do a deal with us, it's a win-win. But that normally means that China wins twice. And the European Union version is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So, in this world, the opportunities, let me just trace out a couple of them. So we know supply chains will be disrupted because it's not just tariffs. It's the fact that President Trump says, I don't want Chinese cars coming from Mexico. And the targeted countries for tariffs are part of global value chains, connector countries that run trade surpluses with the US, which means investment restrictions and tariffs probably mean a realignment of distribution chains. The opportunity is there for those who can be nimble, be driven by an awareness of policy, and importantly, be technologically and data-driven. So in other words, you can shorten supply chains using 3D printing. You have customers who may have preferences for where things are located. You can shift supply chains and be capital light in how you do it because you can rent some of the warehouses and distribution centers. You can also digitalize quite a lot of things that you're offering. So to me, being nimble, being data-driven, and being very aware of the environment means that it's absolutely possible to position yourself so that you can pivot when one market comes under the spotlight, because that is inevitably, I'm afraid, going to happen. Because if you start to move production out of Mexico or Vietnam, which are among the countries that run the biggest trade surpluses with the US, whichever country the product gets moved to is also likely to run a significant trade surplus, because that's the nature of global value chains. So to me, the risk, of course, is there for your customers, for yourselves, but I think being nimble and being able to pivot will be absolutely key. A second area of opportunity is indeed around sustainability. There's a lot of fragmentation in this world. So we know that sustainability is subject to different regimes in different countries. At the same time, Investments in green renewable technologies have much higher returns in many areas than traditional investment because the capital stock is lower. You don't hit diminishing returns to capital. Being able to maneuver and understand that the global sustainability regime is fragmented between pricing carbon and quantity of carbon, I think that is also an area where knowing it's fragmented allows you to pivot and help your customers maneuver into jurisdictions that might be more helpful in that area. So there's a lot more opportunities I could talk to. Maybe we'll focus on it a bit in the Q&A. But I do want to get to how you might want to position yourselves in this environment. So, you already know I don't think you should do economic forecasting, but I do think you should do scenario planning. So in other words, what is your base case scenario? What is your downside scenario? And what is your upside scenario? When you do scenario planning, let me just give you another, I suppose, this is not a caveat, this is coming from economic research. So behavioral economists are those who actually observe what people do, rather than theoretical economists who tell you what you should be doing. Behavioral economists essentially say there's only 5 probabilities people really understand and work to: 100%, 0%, 99%, 1%, and 50-50, which is just tossing a coin. That's completely useless. But the idea that you would have scenarios doesn't mean you need to assign exact probabilities. But if your central scenario, it could be quite uncertain. Maybe it is 50-50. But you're operating, I think, again, in a nimble way to say, the business cycle has turned. I know there's structural opportunities, but I know the world is fragmented. How can I pivot, take no regret actions, and still be able to manage through? And to me, that's how the best firms have actually come through downtimes. So your downside scenario is all the tariffs come into place, supply chains are disrupted, you have industries which are really struggling. That is a non-zero probability event. So what are the things you can do to make sure that you can manage those? And if you can do well in a worst case downside scenario, you'll do really well when things turn and when you look at your upside scenario. So I want to finish with a thought about your upside scenario, which is, and here's my next caveat. Mark Twain reportedly said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme." So everything that I've just said, there is an upside scenario. The upside scenario I want to draw from history. The golden age of economic growth was in the 1950s and 60s. This was a period in which standards of living improved, growth was strong, equality was high, and people were just better off. The 1950s and 60s were also the height of the Cold War. In the 1960s, we're on the brink of nuclear war. And yet, this is still looked at as the golden age of prosperity. So for me, the lessons from history, from crises, is if you focus on what you do, your core offerings, and you're hyper-aware of opportunities and risks around you, there's no reason why you can't control your own destiny, even in such times. So thank you very much, and I look forward to any thoughts you might have.
Linda, thank you so much for that. We only have a couple minutes left, and I want to get back to something you mentioned right at the beginning, monetary policy. You talked about the ECB cutting rates once again, but the elephant in this room, obviously, is the Swiss National Bank. We saw that Switzerland is back in deflation for last month, and obviously the S&B has said in the past it does not love negative interest rates, but there's a good chance it might have to return to them. What do you think the likelihood of that happening? What do you think that is? And how else do you think are these exporters faring with a very, very strong currency? Is there anything they can do about that?
I think negative interest rates, I think, have been something which we have seen can work at the margin, because you'd only do that once you've actually exhausted being able to cut rates. I think one of the challenges of being buffeted by these winds is businesses can only control what they can control. So if you do find not just that rates turn negative, or the S&B for a while had actually pegged the currency because of the competitiveness damage that the currency was doing, I think it's very hard to bet against the central bank, and the central bank is very sensitive to what's happening globally to the Swiss economy. So I would say you've seen it before, and I'm sure you'll manage. I think that's my main lesson from history.
And don't fight the S&B, because trying to do that has hurt many investors and companies before. I had a fascinating discussion during the break, actually, about a completely different topic here, about the trade tariffs and what they're doing to the EU, potentially companies of the EU. Basically, what the US is doing, it's pushing us into the arms of China. And we were always told that we had to decouple from China. All of a sudden, does it mean that we have to recouple with China? And what are the risks associated with that?
This reminds me of it's a Chinese saying, so I'll just translate it, which is a husband and wife shares a bed, but they have different dreams. So in a multi-aligned world, it's absolutely possible to share a bed, but to want different things.
What does that mean for the companies in this room?
So if I broaden this example out, you probably are still cohabiting with the US, but you might get into bed with China. This is a very complicated scenario. But what I mean in a multi-aligned world is you're not going to be aligned with China on everything. But if you want to do, for instance, renewables, China has a dominance in terms of, basically components for EVs. Even if the EU meets all of its targets for the New Green Deal by 2030, and the US meets all of its targets, China will still control 80% of all EV batteries by 2030. So there are things you're going to have to do to work with China, but this is it's a great example of being multi-aligned. But then the US market continues to be the biggest market in the world. So there'll be areas in which you want to have mini deals, which is what the EU does, to get access to certain things with different countries. But it doesn't actually mean you need to be in the same bed with the same dreams. You can have lots of partners at the same time. This is purely economics. This is not this personal advice.
A final quick question I have to ask you on sustainability. You said that this is one of the key growth areas.
Yes.
That said, though, in the US, that is one tough area to operate in when it comes to sustainability, because many of the tax credits have been unwound, and we don't know if they're coming back. What does that mean for companies who want to be active in that space, and they're not getting the support, and they're seeing all that backlash?
Yeah.
How can it still be a growth area?
Yeah, so I've got minus 6 seconds to answer that. Yes. Listen, I think sustainability is going to be, I think, a massive opportunity. And the fragmentation of policy.
Even without the tax credits?
Even without the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits. So, for instance, the European Union has a matching fund, which, roughly speaking, it's about $1 trillion. But I think at the end of the day, it's another good example of trying to maneuver through different regulatory regimes. And I just think on this one, the ship has absolutely sailed. I think private capital will get involved, and I think the European Union has an opportunity to step into the gap and to make the most of what I'm sure is going to improve not just the quantity of our growth, but actually the quality of our lives. So where the US steps back, I hope to see Swiss companies and the European Union, who have been leaders on this, step in.
Linda, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline.